what happens is you can be given a case without any questions and asked to design your own solution, and you've done it enough so that you can actually come up with possible solutions. Okay, case method in the classroom. Typical protocol for my cases. 2 hours, the students prepare cases before each class. And I would say my students generally spend a good 2 to 3 hours preparing it before class. I'm not watching it, but I do try to validate it. The way I try to validate it is for the first 25 minutes of my class, which happens to be a 2.5-hour class in the evenings this semester, I write a question up on the board, I give them 25 minutes to solve it, and then or to write an answer to it. I solve it, yeah, right. That was definitely a misstatement. I give them 25 minutes to try to address the question that I give, which is a general question. It's not something that you can get just by looking at the case. You actually have to have spent some time understanding it to come up with a sensible answer. The next 10 minutes, I give a cold call opening, roughly 10 minutes. That means I will point to a particular student and say, would you care to open? And I don't give them any more direction than that, and then what they do is they basically give their analysis of the decision. Well, at least that's what they're supposed to do. We get considerable variance in the quality of the openings, but that's the general idea. That is a huge motivator for preparation. As someone who went through this process at Harvard, which I modeled fairly closely, I can tell you it's really embarrassing when you're called on to open and you don't really remember anything about the case. I was in the business school play one semester, and I'd sort of skimmed the cases on a Friday afternoon. I come in Monday morning, and the finance professor asked me to open the case. And honest to God, all I could remember was that it was very expensive to transport concrete. And really, that wasn't quite enough to do it, though, gosh darn, I gave it the college try. But I think he realized there was a problem when I had to ask him the title of the case because I could not remember. It was in a finance case book, and I had to ask the title. The fact that I'm still talking about that 31 years later tells you how traumatic it is. But I was very prepared after that. For the next 60 minutes or so, it's facilitated discussion. And my job as a facilitator is to make sure people have an opportunity to participate, to try to guide the discussion along, and if the discussion develops too much consensus, I come in and try to break that consensus up, because we don't want everybody agreeing with each other, because these cases are not designed to produce agreement. And that means I sometimes have to make some pretty stupid arguments, but I can, the great thing about being a facilitator in an undergraduate class is almost any path I start them down, they will happily follow me until I say, what? And then at the end of the case, I give them about 15 minutes for a post-case question. It's always the same 2 questions. What are the 3 most important things you learned from this case, and how did the discussion change your views? Now, the key points is that most of the learning in this process takes place during the discussion. I am amazed. We'll pull an example out before long about what the pre- and post-case look like. Students learn very quickly not to look for the right answer. How many of you have had undergraduates who get very frustrated when you don't tell them what the right answer is? Natural frustration. Well, doesn't take me very long to get them to understand that there is no right answer, because in fact the first case I give them in this class is a case about their class and the way it was designed, and I give them a series of decisions they have to make about how much weight is going to be placed on different subject areas, how strict I am going to be on the deadlines, and a whole series of other questions. And what I tell them is, I will abide by your decisions. And at the end of this, they fill out an online form, and we look at the decisions that they made as to how the class is going to be designed. And one of the things they quickly see is they're all over the place. The great thing about it is I can do whatever I want, because there's such a diversity in decisions that they recognize that I can't actually make a decision based on their input. great thing about the case method is that diversity is beneficial. Now, it is the party line in universities to say diversity is always beneficial. But I'll tell you, when you have people ranging from the 40th percentile to the 99th percentile, as I do in my introductory programming course, and I am trying to teach a course that is of value to them, it is nearly impossible. Because if I make it slow enough so that everybody can keep up, our best students are bored to tears. That type of diversity is very hard because I'm trying to teach a right answer. And in teaching a right answer, the easiest thing is when everybody comes in knowing exactly the same thing and you move them up to the next point. Case method is entirely different. The more diversity you have, the better your discussion is going to be because the more perspectives you're going to have coming into the classroom. And I am passionately in love with having a diverse classroom when I am doing case discussions because it is incredibly valuable. Okay, evaluating learning. Bottom line here, judgment is really hard to measure. This has always been a problem with the case method. When you are teaching people how to find answers, it's find right answers, it's relatively easy to test it. You give them a question, and if they don't find the right answers, you mark them off. It is much, much harder when we're trying to assess judgment because there are a lot of things that aren't in the case which might make their decision sensible based on how they see the world. Now, some of the things that we're trying to do as part of the NSF grant is NSF has an instrument that was developed to measure critical thinking. And so they're allowing us to use it on our students, and we're doing a pre-test and a post-test, and the idea is to try to see if we see a change in critical thinking skills as a consequence of the course treatment. And it's interesting, the folks who developed the survey were saying, now let us tell you all these things that we could do, that you can do to help improve people's score on this instrument. And I said, no, that's not the point. The point here is to see if the case method does it on its own, not if I can manipulate them to do better. Because guess what? If you tell me what the test is going to be, I don't know how, I don't care how well designed the test is going to be. I can figure out ways to make students score better on it. But in this case, we're just doing the case method. We're ignoring all the things that are supposed to build critical thinking, and we're going to see if we measure anything. And we don't know. We're also using our own instrument based on mini cases, again, pre and post test. And members of the grant team are going to be grading the pre and post tests, and they are going to have no idea which one was administered first for each student, because we have one administered at the beginning of the course, one administered at the end of the course. It's a half and half, and I am the only person who knows which test was taken first by a student and which test was taken second, and that means that I don't have to grade them, which is really cool. Finally, direct observations. Pre- and post-case test reports. Now, here's just a quick exercise. Choose a number, but someone just choose a number between 1 and 34. Lower is better because it'll take less time.
2.
2. All right, good. 2 I can count. So what I'm going to do here, and this is way more adventurous than I should be, is I am going to go into the actual answers of a case I did 2 weeks ago, and we'll look at the pretest, and we'll choose the second student. Oh, I could hate myself for this, because there is considerable range. But this was a case on a security system, and hopefully the student actually wrote the question up on top. Oh, this was a really short answer. How depressing is that? What are the major challenges facing nation technology, and what would you recommend overcoming them? That's a very general question. That's a tough question, and I don't specifically address that in the case, though I talk about a lot of the challenges. Actually, that's not a bad answer for a short one. A security product is one that's very hard for customers to see the values of, and I didn't actually put that in the case. And so this was kind of I mean, I often will get a page or so, but this, as I said, I chose them at random. So this is the pre-test, and I grade each one of the pre-tests on a scale of excellent to satisfactory to weak. I give out about 70% satisfactories, and the rest go between excellent and weaks. And it takes me about an hour to grade the pre and post tests each week, but the students now know that I'm reading them, and frankly, if I didn't have to grade them, I might not read them either. So now what we do is we go over to the second answer on the post test and see, so this is the same student. Let's see what the student learned from the case. Again, a relatively short answer, but the point is that this person actually has identified things that they learned from the case, and here this person is talking about how it has changed their perception of how difficult it is to market a new product for securing information and so forth. If somebody had chosen a different number, gosh darn, who chose 2? But we would have gotten, but at any rate, this gives you the idea of what I do every week, and the fact that I was willing to allow this exercise as random tells you volumes about how confident I feel in my students. Yes?
Do you judge the students based on their own increasing proficiency, or do you look at all the students together in terms of excellent week?
I basically use excellent week just based upon it's more based upon kind of the norm for the case, because some cases are very hard and all the answers aren't that great, and some cases are a lot easier and the answers look really good, and so I sort of norm them. That's one of the reasons I try to use a kind of percentile. But I will say there are some students who frequently do excellent on the post case but rarely do it on the pre-case, and we've got some students who seem to do well on the pre-case but don't do as well generally on the post case. And that, at some point, I'm going to have to look at that, because that may be telling me something very important, or it might not. That's why we call it research. All right, so. Okay, now case writing. Why don't we take about a 5-minute break? I'm going to go through, just so that people can stretch their legs. I don't only have about a half an hour more, but the material that I will go over is on a checklist, and the checklist is described in great detail in one of the chapters of the book. It's also an appendix of the book, so that even if I go over it fairly quickly, you can look at it, but I think we ought to just take a break, because it's going to be kind of a whirlwind tour. So why don't we come back at 4 days long, 6 hours each, to run in parallel with the various tracks. And I have some funding from NSF to cover things like registration fees and hotels for that, for maybe up to about 20 people. So that if you had an interest in coming back for that, we would certainly be happy to contact you. The other thing is, particularly if you're a U.S. institution, I am planning to give a much larger proposal to NSF. So there are 3 exhibits that I prepared. They're at the back of your book, but they're also in the handouts for those of you who are working with the handouts. And let me just, did I close that? Yes, of course I closed that. All right, so hold on a second. Go back to the desktop. And rather than go through them in great detail, what I will do is just sort of give you an idea of what's in each. And as I mentioned, for those of you who did not sign up in time to get a copy of the book, I will point you to my website, which has downloadable versions in different formats, free, so that you at least will have access to it electronically. So, the first thing that I have here is an exhibit that I use whenever I'm recruiting for a case study, basically identifying the advantages of participating in developing a discussion case. One of the nice things about developing a discussion case as opposed to a research case is that as the case writer, you do not have to be completely uninvolved in the process because it's more action research. You are not just an observer. As soon as you inject yourself into the decision, you're part of the decision. So if you're going to model the reality, we have to recognize that there's a case writer in there. And from time to time, I will see things in a company that I'm with or in an organization I'm with, and I will say, I noticed this, and this strikes me as odd, or this strikes me as something you might want to think about. And there are a lot of companies that feel really excited about that because they're not paying me anything for it. It's free. And, if a company lets me in to tell their story, they are doing me a huge favor. And the least I can do is give them any insights I come up with. So it creates a nice relationship, and that will become important as we reach the end of this presentation. So I explain what a case study is. I talk about the costs. I emphasize that while there are no dollar costs, there is a cost in time, because I need to talk to enough people to get an accurate presentation. A lot of the companies that I've been dealing with in this past semester have been very small businesses, somewhere between 4 and 20 employees. For a small business like that, you don't have to talk to too many people. Those cases are pretty quick to develop. But since we don't really have any budget to go out and look at large companies, they work fine. And also, the students love them because they're manageable decisions. We're not talking about the CEO of a company in New York that they would never reach. They can identify with them. And let's see. I talk about the process of the case and so forth. Once again, all of these things are available for you. I don't want to read the slides. I just want you to be aware of the resources that you have, both in the books and the handouts. Because I do want to leave a few minutes for questions at the end. Okay, now, the next thing, which I'll spend a little bit longer on, is the writing case study checklist. And this is a checklist of everything you might consider before and while you're writing a case study. I think if anyone ever considered all the issues on this checklist, their head would explode. If you need to consider all of these issues for a particular case, then this case is just going to be too hard to get. But on the other hand, I compiled this list from issues that I have encountered in various cases. And in some cases, they're going to be easy to address. And in some cases, you actually have to think about them. The first and most important thing about case writing is deciding what type of case that you want to write. If you don't know that up front, that's going to filter everything that you're trying to do. And my particular favorite is start with a discussion case, and if you see anything really interesting, then convince them to let you write a research case later after the decisions have been made, and then talk about the processes, because you've observed it all the way through. It's much, much better than looking at an outcome and then trying to get them to explain the facts that led up to that outcome, because they tend to create, it's called the narrative fallacy. They tend to create a narrative that makes them look like geniuses. There are a number of different ways that you can write cases. You can write a case as a standalone thing. You can write a case as accumulation, where you actually have an A, B, C case, which takes you through the process in time. And then in the discussion, what you can do is decide what pieces of the process you want the students to go through, and then you can add later pieces as the discussion progresses. Sometimes you can get comparative cases, like similar companies in the same industry that are doing things very differently. That's wonderful, because it basically shows you that there are lots of different ways to approach a particular problem. The favorite comparative case that I ever wrote involved a small mortgage company, about 20 people. The CEO wanted me to write about this new information system he was developing. And as I started the interviews, I realized something, that this company had some big problems with the developing of this information system. So I convinced the CEO to let me write a case study about what was going wrong from his perspective, because there was a lot of friction between him and the programmer assigned to this project. And then I wrote a second case which told exactly the same story from the perspective of the programmer. And it was really interesting. Like the CEO of the company was saying, I can't understand what the problem is. When I have guests come in, I take them right to see this system under development. This developer should be so proud that he's seeing what's going on. Meanwhile, the developer's saying, I feel like I'm being watched by Japanese tourists in Disney World. My apologies to anyone here from Japan. But he did not like the fact that there were people coming in and looking at him all the time because A, he wasn't the type of person who really liked that, and B, because it meant that he had to basically stop his work, get the system in a state where it could be demonstrated, and, it could cost him hours of time. The only way I was able to get the case was the programmer was a former student of mine, and the CEO was a colleague of mine, a classmate of mine from Harvard, and they both valued their relationship with me more than they valued the stuff that came out, because both of them demonstrated their humanness in telling their various sides of the story. But it made for a really interesting discussion. Okay. There's a whole variety of choices you could have with I like to go with reported observation or lightly disguised. Like I just disguised a case. I changed the names of a couple of people in the case. One of them had severe health problems, and he didn't want that broadcast all over the internet. He was actually a co-author of it. About 7 years ago, he'd been given 2 years to live, and he was struggling with leukemia and stuff, and it had a huge impact on his business. So it was a very interesting and emotional case, but there was no need to give his real name. Ironically, his real name was on the case because I labeled him a co-author, but in the case itself, he had a different name. Now you can go heavily disguised. That starts to be risk, because then you start moving the case into a different context, and I don't know how accurate it's going to be. You can create cases from public sources. That's good, but the most interesting cases are told from the perspective of an individual, the protagonist. When you go out to public sources, all of a sudden you're doing it from the perspective of a reporter, and you can't put words in people's mouths, you can't get quotes, it's much, much harder. And then there are the fictional cases. There are some people who love the idea of fictional cases, but my feeling is I'm not smart enough to create situations that are as wacky as the real world can be. So I'll save my fiction for the great American novel that I will one day foolishly attempt to write. But for my cases, I try to focus on giving observations as best I can. What are you going to take the case for? It's going to be local, external, published. There are a lot of outlets for publishing cases now. I'll talk about some of them at the very end. So that's usually what I focus on. But sometimes I'll create a case purely locally, like the cases I create where my class is trying to decide what grading scale to use. I may not decide to publish those. They won't seem that useful to other people. Okay, common sense. When you're going to go and meet with a case, find out as much as you can about the organization beforehand, because part of your value is that they think you're very smart. There is a peculiar notion out there in industry that college professors are smart, and many of us try not to disabuse them of that notion, that they actually believe that we'll be able to give them useful advice. So you want to keep them thinking that as long as you can. And to do that, you have to learn as much as you can before coming in, because if you ask stupid questions, then they're going to, at the very least, not want to give you that much of their time. Most important thing is, figuring out what the question is. If you're writing a discussion case, the most important thing that you can figure out is what question to ask. Now, even at Harvard, There are some researchers who like to have a particular question they want to answer, and they will go into a case site and try to make the case about that question, even if the managers don't care. There may be some good cases that come out that way. Usually I find them wasted opportunities. Usually I find the best questions to write cases about are the ones that are on the manager's mind, what they're thinking about. We don't want decisions they've already made. We want decisions that they're really thinking about, and they're saying, this is a tough decision. That's the type of decision that can lead to some very interesting discussions. And you also can provide value by helping them frame it. There were some wonderful examples from your presentation this morning, about how, presenting, these cases and perspectives and bringing out discussions really can be very helpful even to people involved in the cases themselves, because you provide a new perspective and also you provide a venue for people to talk about it. And I have had lots of these folks who are joining me, for the protagonists who are watching my class discussions, who really appreciate the opportunity. It's as if I'm doing them a favor, letting them listen in on my undergraduates talking. And the undergraduates really appreciate it as well. Well, I better move quickly because I really am missing sort of the lead of the whole story and why it's at this conference. All of these things are discussed in the case. Figure out what skills you're trying to determine, what type of case you're trying to convey. Figure out how you're going to organize it. Figure out what intellectual skills that you're trying to build with the case. What I like to do when I'm doing a case is I write the opening section and then I give it to the protagonists and say, hey, if we actually write this case, is this the decision you want to make? That way I save myself from writing the whole case before I go ahead with it. And there's some housekeeping things that are important. If they trust you in an organization, they will give you access to all sorts of information that they might not want public. I think it is really important that you, as the case writer, make it very clear that you will guard this just as if you were, a reporter hiding a source, but also you want to figure out a procedure so that if you get a quote from somebody, you don't accidentally cause strife within the company by circulating that quote around before the individual, has had a chance to okay it. So my policy is when I get quotes from people, I always send them the section of the case with the quote first. Not the person in charge of the company, not the person who's going to achieve the case. I want to get everybody satisfied with what they have said before I release it to bosses and stuff. I also make it clear I'm not a spy, and I will not go around and tell tales on people I've had in the interview. My job is to be an objective reporter, but I do not want to make a situation more complicated through the act of case writing. And so you develop policies for how documents are going to be circulated. Who's going to set up the interviews and all this, just so that there's no misunderstanding. You are a guest in their house, act like a respectful guest, and one of the things you'll be amazed is how much information they will give you. It's really, and a lot of times they'll say, well, I'm going to give you this, but you should tell me whether or not it should go in the case. In many cases, they will take your judgment as to whether something is too confidential to put in a case study. So you have to treat that trust carefully. Because truthfully, a lot of people don't know what is commercially sensitive data or organizationally sensitive data. They just don't know. And you, as part of the process, can help them decide. You can say, well, I wouldn't put that in the case. And, once you start doing that, you can build up a lot of trust. This is very important. Okay, so you write the case. There are some organizations. I will show you a website where I have the classic organization for my cases, and I put that up for the journal that I'm launching. that works for about 90% of all cases. Basically, a sort of a top-down approach where you describe the problem, then you move to sort of the industry, the context, a series of sort of general things to inform your audience. Then you sort of drill down within the organization until you're back at the decision at the very end of the case. And I would say, probably 80 or 90% cases of discussion cases are written that way, and it's a pretty good formula. And these, and if you're doing a research case, it's a little bit different. And I have a lot of stuff like that in the book. And as I mentioned, a lot of these materials were really intended for like a 24 hours worth of content. So trying to squeeze them into 2 is going to make me feel a little rushed. So I'm just going to move on down. All right. Now, go back here. There's also a release document. I've got a sample there. Just, you typically want to make the organization feel like they're in control up till the very end. And so typically you will not release the case for use or publication without a release document being signed. You want to make that release document make the company as comfortable as possible. I've only had one case where I did all the work of writing a case and then the release document was not signed. That was a subprime credit card company. I was working with the president. This was a very large company, and the president was all excited about the case, but he decided to run it by the owner/chairman of the board, who he had not told me was responsible for final approval. And the guy looked at it and said, this makes our industry look too good. We don't want to attract competitors. And since he's already done all the work, there's really no reason to approve it. So I walked away from that case. But that's the only time I've ever had to do that. And this is probably after 40 or 50 case writing experiences. Most of the time, you build up a nice trust relationship. Okay, so now publication opportunities. This book is published by the National Center for Case Teaching and Science. This is good for science cases. It does not have any discussion cases. But if you're teaching science-related courses, there are a lot of good examples there. And there's a wonderful website. And this was an NSF-sponsored project as well. Discussion cases in the information technology and MIS area. This is the only area that I'm pretty knowledgeable in. Journal of IT Education discussion cases is about to be launched. I am the editor-in-chief. If you submit a case, just, hey, remind me that you were there at my seminar. Cool. There's a lot of material available for that right now on my personal website. The actual journal website is, I'm lucky enough to be the first journal being launched on this new open source package, and so it may be a while before everything's tuned up there, but my personal website, which I'll show you, has this. Journal of IT Teaching Cases is another good outlet. What's interesting there is there's a mixture of example cases and discussion cases and exercise cases, so it's not just one type of case there. In fact, it's rather limited discussion cases. North American Case Research Association, NACRA. I just found out about this a few days ago, but they publish discussion cases across all the business disciplines. And I know the person who is like the first vice president of it right now. She's an excellent case writer from Harvard Business School. She was the one who told me about this. And that's a good place to publish. The European Case Clearinghouse accepts open submissions and has prizes and stuff, also for discussion cases. So that's another good outlet. These two are general in the business area, whereas these two will tend to be more focused on information technology. I am sure there are other outlets, but truthfully, these are the outlets that I know about. And as I mentioned, I'm planning to submit a case to NACRA later on because it doesn't fit in the IT area. It's interesting. It's a local franchise chain, and they've just been, they've got 10 units in our local area, and they've just been approached by some people in China to open the first Greek restaurant in Beijing. And they're trying to decide whether they actually want to do a franchise deal in Beijing. Talk about it. You've got an Estonian founder operating a Greek restaurant in the US trying to decide whether or not to open a site in Beijing. Is this globalization gone amok, or is the world really that flat? That, by the way, is the opening line from the case, and it's all true. Okay, broader impacts. This is what I really wanted to talk about, and of course I'm running out of time. But if you look at Harvard Business School, which is by far the most successful business school in the world, don't believe rankings, in terms of impact on the business community and impact on business education, there is no school that is even remotely comparable. And they've got the egos to prove it. But if you take a look, you write cases for companies. The case research ends up in the classroom, both in the MBA program and in the executive program, where people get really excited. They're collaborating with other disciplines. A lot of cases now are being written with folks from the engineering faculty and from the medical faculty, because you can't deal with these problems without that type of expertise. The companies, after a case is written, want to extend their case writing engagements. This leads to consulting opportunities, bring in extra revenue. It leads to sites for future research, and it leads to board opportunities. So now you're embedding yourself in practice. The bottom line is we're moving from research to practice back to research, from research to the classroom to practice, from business into other disciplines to practice, to the classroom, and so forth. It is incredibly integrative. The examples we heard this morning take us another level. Here we're actually using discussion cases to impact local, entire nations in Central America, bringing practice and government and labor and non-government organizations together. And the case method provides a venue for these discussions. Interestingly, this is my map of the agribusiness program at Harvard Business School, which is one of the most successful case writing enterprises, but which has failed to achieve academic respectability as a discipline. And as a consequence, they keep it going because they're generating $3 million in revenue a year with agribusiness seminars. So it's going to keep going for as long as that money pit is going. But the point is, the very term agribusiness came out of Harvard Business School. A whole way of thinking about an industry was the result of this, and the person who was most responsible for this, Dr. Ray Goldberg, was, he has written over or collaborated with writing over 1,000 cases. There's probably no one in history who has ever done that much. And I worked with him as a consultant, and I can tell you, when he went out into practice, people listened. In fact, it was great being a consultant working for his company because people listened, but they didn't know what the hell he was talking about most of the time. And so we, the consulting firm, would then be engaged to help explain to them what it was that he was doing. He'd go into companies, and no matter what the company was, he'd be talking about biotechnology. We make farm equipment. What does biotechnology have with us? We better call consultants to figure this out. But at any rate, the point of this is it provides an incredible way to get into practice. And the great thing is all this stuff ends up in the classroom. How often does our research end up in the classroom in a non-contrived way? Well, all I can say is this semester I've collaborated in writing 10 different cases that are in the classroom. So, here's our program at USF. Our grant started in June. We established a multidisciplinary TEAK. No, I think that would probably be team. But yeah, we were kind of wooden. But this is, 10 new cases have been developed before, and 11th is just about to be released. We've launched a journal. Here we're going from research to practice to research. 9 protagonists have sat in on the discussion. Now we're getting practice into the classroom. And practice, we've got one protagonist who's sat in on 4 discussions. In every program we've got, we use his case because he's so interested in the results. He's launching a new geocoded social media tool based on disaster management stuff he did for Hurricane Katrina with his company. Very interesting product. We've had one student hired by a case study. Another one is collaborating with one of the protagonists, developing her website. Now we're getting the classroom into practice. We've got one site asking about where to make donations. Now we've got practice starting to support the needs of the institution. National Science Foundation funding is one of the key things USF is trying to do. Here, our research is now impacting the institution again. The point is, this is incredibly integrated. And some people don't call it research. But what you have to remember is that a discussion case is not the simple product of case writing. It's not like research where the publication is what's going to be what actually matters. What case writing does is it puts in place a process that ties you together with practice. And I believe the first couple of business schools that do this really effectively locally are going to become the Harvards of their local community. You know, you may not be able to spend $25,000 or $30,000 per case as Harvard does, but it doesn't cost that much to do cases on a local business. And my feeling is that business schools and engineering schools should make it a point that no practitioner in their local area sneezes without one of us coming and wanting to write a case study on the implications of that sneeze and what decisions it brings up. Because I believe if we do that, then as we run into the financial challenges that so many institutions are doing, practice will step up to the plate because they see the value that we are delivering. And the value comes from us, it comes from our students. It doesn't necessarily come from the publications in journals that practitioners could not even possibly identify as fake journals, as real journals. Okay, now, if you want to find out a little bit more about this, if you go to grandin.com and click on Case Project, I put this up on my personal website. It's just too big a pain in the neck to get the university to set up such a site for me. We've got a whole bunch of links. All the materials from this handout are here in PDF. I've got some handouts here in Word documents, so if you want to modify them for your own purposes, they're available. I have the submission templates for the Journal of IT Education discussion cases, plus a PDF full of snarky comments about why I did certain things. I wrote up our, because I'm just out of control, I wrote up our submission template as if it were a case study, so it reads as if someone trying to decide whether or not to submit to the journal, and thinking about things like, what fonts should I use, and stuff like that. I mean, it's a little contrived, but I had fun doing it. I've started a blog talking about what my plans are related to, the potential grant proposal. Here are collections of the cases we've gotten released so far from the ones that we developed as part of the grant. Here is a downloadable copy of the book in PDF form and also Mobi, which you can move over to a Kindle, and EPUB that you can move over to an iPad.